Welcome, everybody. So, we hopefully will get to the discussion very, very quickly. But, as people are coming in, when I introduce myself, I'm Stephanie Grilly. I am also on the Board of Governors. And for the past few years, I've had the privilege, and I do say privilege, of being one of the organizers for these Thursday night Careers, Life, and Yale programs. I get to contact Yaleys whose work interests me, and out of the blue, I ask them if they'll be a participant, a guest in one of these shows, and I can say the enthusiasm which they respond. It speaks to our community and our interest in Yaleys connecting to other Yaleys, students, and alum. In fact, this is an initiative of the Careers, Life, and Yale Committee, which is alumni to alumni outreach, alumni to student outreach, and it connects to an initiative that's part of your Yale Alumni Association, the Careers, Life, and Yale, which is headed by Steve Bloom, who joined us momentarily, but also part of the team, Kate Gustafson and Chelsea Gladue. And Chelsea is, in fact, the person that's going to make sure that everything runs smoothly tonight. In addition to these Thursday night programs, another major effort of the Careers, Life, and Yale program, of course, is Cross Campus, which is an app that allows all sorts of connections from schools, from ages, from interest, and unlike the Thursday night programs, it is 24/7. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to check out the Cross Campus app and to sign up. In terms of the procedure tonight, we're never quite sure. We always have to be a little bit nimble in terms of what happens with this specific dynamic on any show. But we start off asking you to put your questions or comments in the chat. And then when we roll into starting to ask questions, I will ask you to ask your question, unless, of course, you would prefer it to be otherwise. I tend to go in the order they came, but particularly tonight, I've seen there's a lot of people coming into the Zoom space. If there are questions that may be kind of are similar, I might bundle them, or I might jump ahead to a question that's more dovetails into another, but hopefully we'll be able to get to all of your questions. This is conversation style. I will ask Dr. Chutkin some questions at the outset to kind of get things going, but feel free to put your questions, comments in chat. Tonight's show is, we have different channels. This show tonight is part of the Lux A Veritas channel, and of course you know what that translates as. And the speakers are in some ways, well, let's just say, we know we're living in a time of uncertainty, but these are Yaleys who are maybe forward-looking to things that are promising, and maybe can embody more optimism about what the future may hold, but also in a way that may have personal significance for us all, so that we can potentially make meaningful changes in our own lives. And tonight, I have been looking forward to tonight's show for some time. I think we have a fabulous guest tonight, and in fact, in terms of Lux A Veritas, she is part of the shifting paradigm in medicine, from models of disease to models of wellness. And of course, if you signed up tonight, you know that the guest is Dr. Robin Chutkin, who certainly has credentials in the realm of integrative gastroenterology, which sounds a little bit like a lyric from a Rocky Horror Picture Show song. But in terms, we'll find out what being an integrative gastroenterologist entails. But not only did she go to Yale as an undergraduate, she went to medical school at Columbia. She's been on the faculty at the Georgetown University Hospital. And in 2004, she had started her own digestive center for wellness. But interestingly enough, alongside what, if she were to share her resume with you, would certainly be estimable in sort of the hallowed halls of medicine. She's also well known as a medical expert for more popular forms of communication, including the Today Show, CBS This Morning. She's been interviewed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, the Discovery Health Channel. You've seen the impressive list of her publications, and her book, Gut Bliss, which intriguing title in and of itself, was the foundation basis for her own PBS special with the same name. So I have a lot to ask her. I'm sure you have a lot to ask her. We want to get into what exactly a microbiome is. We want to be able to cut through the hype and get to the facts. We want to know about what it means for us. But since we're among Yaleys tonight, and this is the Careers Life in Yale show, I'd like to start by asking Robin if she would share with us a little bit about her journey, including her experience at Yale, how she got into medicine and specifically gastroenterology, and how does one become a media expert? Robin.
Stephanie, thank you so much. And thank you so much to the Yale Alumni Association. It's so great to be amongst friends. I see a couple classmates and underclassmen like Steve Bumbaugh turned up to heckle me. So thank you so much. And it's great to be in the company of so many like-minded scatological folks who are also interested in stool and the microbiome. I can tell you that when I was in medical school, people thought, gastroenterology? What's a nice girl like you wanting to wade through stool all day long? Everybody was clamoring to do ophthalmology and dermatology and orthopedics, but I dare say that the gut is having a moment, and it's wonderful to be a part of it. I arrived in New Haven in 1983. I had grown up in Jamaica. I had lived in the Bahamas for a while, and I'd spent a gap year in France and Spain. I did not know a single person in the state of Connecticut, but I realized that everybody more or less spoke English. And so this was going to be a lot easier than being in school in France without speaking French. So embarked on what turned out to be a wonderful 4 years at Yale. I was in Styles. I played squash. I was a bottom of the squash team, but enthusiastic. And I was an English and biology major. And I'm proud to say I've written every word of the 4 books myself as a result of being an English major. And then, as Stephanie said, was in medical school at Columbia and spent about 8 years there from medical school, residency. I did a chief resident year there, Mount Sinai for GI fellowship, and then the faculty at Georgetown. What's really interesting about this whole process of the microbiome is that we seem to have somehow missed it when we were all studying medicine, and we were all figuring out how to get super clean, how to sanitize everything. And to be fair, the discovery of penicillin, gosh, now almost a century ago, is definitely ranks up there with one of the, incredible medical discoveries of the last century. But it's also clear that the needle has swung a little bit the other way, and we are a little bit in this era of Pharmageddon with our therapeutics, where we are in an era of overdiagnosis and overtreatment. Many of us are overmedicated, and we are seeing the results of a lot of this in the gut. When I started medical school, I was quite sure I was going to be an orthopedic surgeon. My dad is an orthopedic surgeon. My older brother's an orthopedic surgeon. And I said, yes, orthopedics. And within a few minutes of the orthopedic surgery rotation, I realized there was a lot of sawing and hammering. And orthopedics is great field, but I realized it was not for me. And one of the things that was appealing about gastroenterology is that it is sort of an equal opportunity employer. It is young and old and male and female. And eventually, things can go wrong with the GI tract, and that's true for everyone. So I liked the breadth of it. And I did like the procedures, to be honest. We think of the gut as, not an exciting place, but I'll tell you, the gut is beautiful, and particularly when it's well cleaned out, the colon, but the upper GI tract, the villi, you can actually see those little finger-like villus projections. You see the peristaltic wave-like movements. It really is a fabulous organ. And when you think about where your GI tract is located, it's in the center of your body. It is literally the engine. And I know I'm biased as a gastroenterologist, everybody thinks their organ is the most important, but the gut literally feeds the rest of the body. And so in this sort of, new era of the gut microbiome, et cetera, we see all these connections. We see the gut-brain axis. We know about the enteric nervous system, the second brain in our gut. We have about 7 times as many nerve cells in our GI tract as we have in our spinal cord, not in our central nervous system. We know that the gut communicates with a lot of these different organs. The gut immune connection, 70 to 80% of the immune system is actually physically located in the gut. It's just on the other side of the gut lining. You have the trillions of microbes on one side, the immune cells on the other, and there's constant interaction. So we know that the gut plays a huge role in what's going on in the immune system. If we were to sort of draw a diagram with the gut in the middle, we would see neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's, we would see mood disorders, depression, anxiety, we would see dementia, autism, we would see a connection to the heart, to heart failure, coronary artery disease, even arrhythmias like atrial fibrillation, metabolic disorders, diabetes, obesity, or diabesity, the combination of the two, pulmonary disorders, lung disease, atopy and allergy, and autoimmune diseases that affect 1 in 4 Americans. So we see this gut connection to all of it. And whilst we can't necessarily draw a straight line between what's going on in the gut and the development of disease, we know that there is a strong connection, particularly with autoimmune diseases. So to backtrack a little bit, Stephanie, and talk about the definition, the microbiome refers to all the organisms that live in and on our bodies, not just in our gut, but primarily in our gut. And we're talking about bacteria, viruses, fungal organisms, parasites, one-cell organisms like protozoa, archaea, so all of the different organisms. And although they're microscopic, if you scrape them all up, they would weigh about 4 pounds. So how much are we talking about? More than 1 billion organisms in 1 drop of fluid in your colon. So a lot. We have about 23,000 genes, somewhere around there, and we have about 8 million microbial genes coding for different things. So we are far outnumbered by our microbes. And when we think about who's doing all the work, yes, they're digesting the food and making smelly gas, but they're also synthesizing vitamins. They're breaking down toxins, they're training the immune system, they're activating genes. And I'll give you a sort of real world example of that. If you're admitted to the hospital with an infection, you will probably end up on a broad spectrum antibiotic, meaning an antibiotic that is active against a wide array of bacteria. And after about 4 or 5 days, a phlebotomist in the hospital drawing the blood will request an order for vitamin K, that vitamin K be administered, because they will notice that when they draw your blood in the hospital, your blood isn't clotting because the antibiotics have killed off a lot of the healthy bacteria, and the microbiome is an essential component for making vitamin K. So without a healthy microbiome, your blood can't clot. That's one of the examples. And there are lots of examples of cofactors. We know that a lot of the serotonin, which we think of as a feel-good hormone, one of the neurotransmitters, is made in the gut. So there are a lot of examples of this sort of central role of the GI tract. And what we've realized is that our health is quite closely linked to the health of our microbiome, and disruption of the microbiome, what we term dysbiosis, is linked, foundational in some cases, in other cases, maybe just an additional factor, but a link to a lot of these diseases that I talked about. In the 1950s, David Strawn, who was an epidemiologist at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, embarked on a study in England in the sort of post-industrial London. They were seeing tons of autoimmune diseases, particularly eczema and hay fever, asthma essentially, in British children. And so the British government tasked this epidemiologist, David Strawn, at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, with figuring out why they were seeing these rising rates. And he embarked on a 21-year study, 17,000 children from birth to adulthood. And he found two startling things and very unexpected. The first was that children who were part of large families where there were siblings and cousins and everybody sneezing on you and infecting you, those kids who were exposed to a lot of childhood illnesses had very low rates of autoimmune diseases as adults. The second thing he found was that children from more affluent households, which at the time in 1950s London, affluence was associated with greater levels of hygiene, bathing, washing, etc. I'm sure that is not the case today. It's certainly not the case in my household, where there's not a lot of bathing and washing going on necessarily, but at the time, more affluent households had more bathrooms, and it wasn't uncommon for households of 10, 12 people to have just one bathroom. So they found that these kids that were in smaller households who were cleaner were sicker. They were having more autoimmune diseases. And if you look at a map of the world today, you still see this pattern in Northern Europe, in more affluent countries, in North America, Western Europe, Northern Europe. You see high rates of autoimmune diseases, of Crohn's, of ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, MS, etc. And in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, we see much lower rates. And this was the basis of what David Strawn published this study in the British Medical Journal in 1989. And it was the basis of what we now call the hygiene hypothesis, which basically says that we need exposure to germs, particularly in childhood, to train our immune system so that we don't end up with an overactive immune system, which is what an autoimmune disease is. It's an immune system that is overreacting to normal stimuli in the body and destroying the body's normal tissue. So that turned this whole idea of what we thought we knew about cleanliness on its head and made us consider that maybe it's not a good thing to be too clean, to be living in a super-sanitized environment where you're eating food from a highly pesticized processed food chain, where there are too many antibiotics, where there's not enough exposure to dirt, to farm animals, to soil microbes, all of these things. And so one of the things that we've seen is that rurality, exposure to animals, outdoor soil, is protective against many of these autoimmune diseases, particularly the two that I treat, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. So it's been a shift in thinking really in medicine, where I spent most of my time in medical school figuring out how to make everything super clean. And it turns out, I mean, of course, if you're doing surgery, you want a sterile environment, but it turns out that how we're living in terms of literally even just living within glass and concrete and not having that exposure to the outdoors seems to be a factor in many of these diseases that we're seeing. So I'm going to stop for a second, Stephanie, in case there's some more questions you want to ask. I could talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
Nonstop.
In fact, we're starting to get questions already, but if Matthew, I'm going to use your question as kind of a springboard for my second question to Robin. Because Matthew asked, is said by someone that it is said by some that one can identify who has multiple sclerosis by the spectrum of bacteria in the gut. How realistic is that? So what I want to turn that into is, this right now, even though there has been, solid research going on for quite some time now, it's a hot topic. So there are a lot of claims right now for, sort of good bacteria and what it can do and what it leads to. So there's a lot of clickbait. And so I wonder if you could spend a little time kind of laying out for us what's out there that we know is good, solid information, and other things that just might be oversell, taking a small study and sort of running with it, or even people who are making supplements and other things and selling us something Well, you see where I'm going.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I will come back to Matthew's question, but Matthew, you're absolutely right. We have been able to identify microbial signatures of lots of diseases, fibromyalgia. We have a long COVID profile that we can identify. Researchers at Cornell were able to analyze the stool microbiome and pretty accurately, with about 89% accuracy, identify patients with chronic fatigue syndrome, what we call ME/CFS right now, Crohn's disease, et cetera. And MS, we know a lot of MS is related to EBV infection. So we are starting to see these microbial signatures. The tricky thing is this cause or effect? So for example, and I'm going to come back, Stephanie, to talk about all the snake oil out there and what we should be aware of, which is almost all of it. But if we look at, for example, going with this, yes, if we can look at these microbial signatures, but if we look at SARS-CoV-2, for example, we know that when SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, binds to the ACE2 receptors, of which there are about 100 times more ACE2 receptors in the gut than in the lungs. And so the gut is a common portal of entry. When it binds, it induces dysbiosis, that same disruption in the microbiome I talked about. At the same time, we have a landmark study from UMass Amherst in 2021 that showed that analysis of the microbiome was the most predictive, the most accurate predictor of outcome from COVID. So when they looked at the microbiome, people who had high levels of a bacteria called Enterococcus faecalis and low levels of a bacteria called Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, which are sort of classic disrupted microbiomes, those patients had worse outcomes, and they could predict with 92% accuracy, which is more accurate than age, comorbidities, even inflammatory markers in the blood. They could predict with 92% accuracy who would have respiratory distress, end up on a ventilator, and die from looking at the microbiome. So we see this high predictive value, but at the same time, we know that COVID itself can induce dysbiosis. So it becomes this little bit of a puzzle. We know people with a disrupted microbiome, and that's true of all the comorbidities, people who have obesity, people with autoimmune diseases, people with lung disease, et cetera, heart disease. These conditions are all associated with disruptions in the microbiome, and they all contribute to a worse outcome with COVID. But at the same time, having COVID can also induce dysbiosis. So for some of these conditions, and particularly the ones that have been very difficult to really understand, like chronic fatigue syndrome, the ME/CFS, fibromyalgia, some of these others, it's turning out that many of these are probably post-infectious related to, we have examples of rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis that are related to Epstein-Barr virus infection, mono, which we know about already. Chronic hepatitis, the #1 cause of liver transplantation throughout the world, HIV, AIDS, these are all post-viral syndromes, post-infectious syndromes. So it's hard to know whether somebody who already has a disrupted microbiome is at risk. I mean, we know that to be the case, but we also know that these infections themselves can cause some dysregulation and disturbance in the microbiome. Now, to get to the snake oil, we have really no evidence that the average healthy person benefits from a probiotic. I don't take a probiotic, but what I do is I try and get outside in nature to get some soil microbes, because after we're born, those of us who are lucky enough to be born vaginally, when you make your way through the birth canal, the baby's head turns posteriorly so that it can literally swallow a mouthful of microbes from the perineum, that area between the vagina and the rectum that is very microbially rich. And so babies born vaginally have that benefit. They get seeded with those important founding species. Babies born via C-section are colonized with hospital-acquired Staphylococcus aureus instead of the mother's healthy bifidobacterium, et cetera. And as a result, C-section babies have higher rates of asthma, of autoimmune disease, of allergies, and of obesity. And C-section babies that are not breastfed have even higher risks because there are things in breast milk that also are very beneficial for the microbiome. So you would think, oh, here's a perfect opportunity to give microbes back, but we have very little evidence that taking a probiotic does anything. Why? First of all, the numbers, the colony forming units. we're talking about staggering amounts of bacteria in the gut, in the colon. So it's really hard to ingest that amount of bacteria. It's hard for a manufacturer to keep that bacteria alive in a shelf-stable form, whether it's a liquid, a powder, a capsule, even refrigerated. Bacteria have a very short half-life, about half an hour. So you can imagine you have to start with a very large amount because they're reproducing and they're dying, etc., very quickly. So very few of the probiotics on the market actually have the amount of bacteria they say they have. Even when they do, there's very little evidence that those bacteria are actually taking root, recolonizing, repopulating your gut in a meaningful way. You're mostly pooing them out, is what's happening. And then, of course, the most important part, you have to feed them. So I use the analogy of taking a cheetah from the Serengeti. I don't know if that's really where the cheetah are. But, you're taking a cheetah from the plains of Africa, and I'm bringing the cheetah to my backyard in Washington, D.C. And I have to think about, well, this cheetah is used to running 60, 70 miles a day on the plains, and now it's circling my backyard. What food? The cheetah is used to, downing a wildebeest, and now I'm giving the cheetah dog food, or, so we have to think about the habitat. So if we're introducing even these healthy bacterial species from our vegan friends or from the Hadza tribe in Tanzania who have these very robust microbiomes, if we are not feeding them what those microbes need to thrive, we are not going to really get meaningful repopulation. What you can do, so exposure to soil microbes, I went on a digression about the birth canal, but that's where we initially get our big inoculum of microbes. And then after that, we primarily get microbes from the soil. So being outside, literally, being in the dirt, if you can, eating food that is grown in microbially rich soil, rather than food that's grown industrially. So a lot of the organic food now in the supermarket is sort of industrial organic. So getting to a local farmer's market, buying food with dirt on it that's microbially rich makes a difference. Fermented foods, we know Justin Sonnenberg and his wife in California do wonderful microbiome research. And we know from a lot of their studies on sauerkraut is a combination of three different things. It's prebiotic, it's probiotic, and it's postbiotic. And for those of you who may be a little less familiar with what those things are, prebiotics are the healthy fibrous foods that feed our gut bacteria. So that would be, think beans and greens, legumes, oats, green vegetables, fibrous stuff like the stalk of the asparagus, celery, onion, garlic, all that stringy fiber. Those are all prebiotic foods. Probiotics are the live bacteria, either the ones we're taking from the store or ideally the ones that are already in our gut. And then postbiotics are the metabolites that the bacteria make. And one of the most well-known classes of postbiotics are short-chain fatty acids. Those would be things like butyric acid, propionic acid, acetic acid. And short-chain fatty acids are important for two reasons. Number one, they help to keep the lining of the gut healthy and intact. And number two, they guide the immune system, they modulate the immune system to prevent the immune system from overreacting, destroying tissue, autoimmune disease, or underreacting. They keep it at that nice balanced level. So short-chain fatty acids are produced primarily when the bacteria in our gut ferment fiber. And that's why it's so important to get in those plants. We have a landmark study from 2018 by the American Gut Project, which is a wonderful group of researchers headed by Rob Knight. And that 2018 study was the largest global microbiome study. They looked at over 10,000 people in over 40 different countries. And they found that the number one predictor of a healthy microbiome was the variety of different plants that people ate. And the magic number seemed to be somewhere around 30 or more different plants. The interesting thing was it didn't matter what people call themselves, whether they claimed to be vegan or vegetarian or pescatarian. It was simply the number of different plant foods per week. 10 or fewer different plant foods per week was associated with a much less diverse, less healthy microbiome, and greater than 30. And 30 different plant foods a week might sound daunting, but if you think about a bowl of oatmeal, let's say you make it with a plant-based milk like almond milk, that's one, oats two, walnuts, pumpkin seeds, raisins, blueberries, a little maple syrup, you get credit for that. Shaved coconut, cinnamon, I'm at 9 with my bowl of oatmeal. Then think about a salad, lettuce, tomato, cucumber, chickpeas, a little broccoli, some parsley, basil. You get credit for fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, legumes, herbs, spices, all of it. So the variety of different foods we're eating is really important for creating a healthy microbiome, just as diversity is important in our communities, at work, et cetera, in our schools. Diversity turns out to be very important for the gut also. So we have that landmark study from 2018. And so I really try to get my patients to focus on this, to really look at the diversity of plants they're eating, to try and limit the highly processed and the sort of pesticized food chain, the foods grown with glyphosate, et cetera. And, I think there is room on the plate for some animal protein for those who are animal protein eaters, but we don't want to crowd out the plants with animal protein. That's a really important thing. So if we look at a food like sauerkraut, to circle back to that, sauerkraut is the fiber, so it's the prebiotic. In the process of fermentation, there's all the lactobacillus that are being generated from the sauerkraut, so it's probiotic. And then it's also these postbiotic metabolites being made. So we found that eating a tablespoon of sauerkraut will be much more beneficial to most people than buying a store-bought probiotic. That being said, we have some important and really fascinating research in the world of probiotics. There was a study from Thailand about 3 weeks ago looking at a condition called MRSA. Many of you have probably heard it referred to as MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is really an epidemic, and people are colonized. Staph is one of the organisms that's all over our body, in our skin, and our gut. People get colonized with this methicillin-resistant staph, and part of why it's so common is because antibiotics are so common, not just the ones we're taking that are prescribed by our physicians, but 70 to 80% of the antibiotics in the US are used in the animal industry. So they're used to fatten the animals, to prevent infections, et cetera. So even if you are a very judicious antibiotic taker, you may be getting antibiotics in the dairy or the animal protein you're consuming. So, because of all these antibiotics that we're exposed to, our microbes become resistant. So you develop this MRSA, MRSA, and MRSA can cause lots of problems: boils on the skin, chronic rashes, more serious infection in the lungs and the blood. And what these researchers in Thailand were able to do, they used a bacteria called Bacillus subtilis, and they gave a big inoculum of this Bacillus subtilis, and they were able to decolonize the gut. Now, past efforts to remove MRSA have involved large amounts of heavy-duty antibiotics. And of course, what that does is it gets rid of a lot of the healthy bacteria too. And so you're sort of digging a deeper hole, creating more dysbiotic gut. So this was a really successful study looking at a probiotic to sort of crowd out the MRSA. So I think we're going to see a lot more of those studies, but that's very different from, going to the store and taking a probiotic. So I advise the average healthy person the same advice I give about vitamins. We don't really have any evidence that a multivitamin is doing anything other than making your pee smell funny. But there are specific situations where a vitamin could be helpful if you have low vitamin D, if you have low B12 because you have Crohn's disease or pernicious anemia, if you have if you've been on an antibiotic, your vitamin K may be low. So I really advocate for a sort of more personalized medicine approach where we're looking at each person individually and deciding what they may or more commonly may not need, rather than just sort of taking these supplements willy-nilly. So I think we have lots more questions. So maybe.
And I was going to say, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share. This is jam-packed full of good info, and it's prompting a lot of questions. So I'm going to go ahead to make sure that we get to all the questions. As I said, in terms of being flexible, I'm going to go ahead and sort of field the questions for you. And in fact, we've had a couple of questions, one from Cara, that relate to stool transplants. And I wonder if you could address the efficacy of stool transplants.
Yes, Cara, thanks so much for that. One of my favorite topics. And, stool transplants aren't that new. We have evidence from ancient China of stool transplants. In the animal kingdom, many animals, young animals, naturally, pandas, elephants, some species of dogs, the young animals will eat the adult stool in an effort to colonize their guts with bacteria that they haven't yet developed. So what we know about stool transplants in the modern era was for a condition called Clostridium difficile, known as C. diff, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. Clostridium difficile is a bacteria that is present in the gut in low levels in many people. When you take an antibiotic, we know from Marty Blazer's important work at NYU, he was a chief of infectious diseases at NYU, that a typical broad spectrum antibiotic, a week of antibiotics will remove about a third of your gut bacteria. And they're not necessarily coming back. So judicious use of antibiotics is always the goal. But what we see is that people who've been on antibiotics, who are colonized with Clostridium difficile, or who are exposed to it in a hospital setting, either if they're hospitalized or visiting someone in the hospital, can develop overwhelming C. diff infection, where because a lot of their bacteria have been removed by the antibiotics, the Clostridial species now overgrow. Now they're in a feeding frenzy, like, oh, look at all this room, we're going to multiply. And lo and behold, they have a C. diff infection. That can lead to colitis, inflammation of the colon, and life-threatening infection that kills about 30,000 people in the US every year. And some people have to have their colon removed if the C. diff is very severe. So for decades, we've treated C. diff with the very thing that causes C. diff, antibiotics, which doesn't seem like a great idea, but that's what we've had. So we've used potent antibiotics like vancomycin, metronidazole, to try and kill the C. diff while realizing that, yes, we're also further disrupting the microbiome. And as you can imagine, that's been fraught with recurrences, et cetera. And so about a decade and a half ago, there was a study looking at stool transplants to treat C. diff for people who had refractory C. diff. And they had to stop the study in the middle for ethical reasons, because the FMT, fecal microbiota transplant, stool transplant group, the results were so vastly superior, even before the study was finished, that they said for ethical reasons, we can't continue. And so that study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine became a sort of landmark study for stool transplants for C. diff, for refractory C. diff. And then came a lot of red tape with the FDA trying to figure out how to classify a stool transplant. They classified it as a medical device, which doesn't seem quite right. But clearly they needed to do some kind of regulation around it. And for reasons, Steph, that you touched on earlier, for snake oil, because clinics were popping up everywhere, claiming to be able to cure all kinds of diseases by doing stool transplants. And while in certain cases, like C. diff, I think, like for many autoimmune diseases, autism, other things that we've seen promise with, Parkinson's disease, stool transplants may be transformative. We can also transmit things through stool. We can transmit COVID, HIV, syphilis, all kinds of things, infections. And so one of the things we do at Georgetown when we're doing stool transplants is we try to have a close contact. Somebody who, ideally somebody you've had intimate contact with. You've already been swapping bodily tissues. So we don't have to worry as much about hepatitis, syphilis, et cetera. We do test for all of those things, but an intimate contact is always easier. What we have found, though, just like a solid organ transplant, we want super poopers, a super pooper donor. We somehow, in the beginning of FMT, we thought, oh, we'll just take stool and it will be fine. And for something like C. diff, where you're just acutely trying to crowd out all those Clostridial species with healthy bacteria, the quality of the stool isn't hugely significant. But when we look at studies where we are trying to put diseases like Crohn's and colitis into remission, chronic autoimmune diseases, we're trying to treat Parkinson's and autism, the quality of the stool is essential. Just as if you were getting a liver transplant, you wouldn't want a liver transplant from an 80-year-old alcoholic who has a cirrhotic liver. You wouldn't want a stool transplant from somebody who's been taking lots of antibiotics and eating at McDonald's and who's not a good fiber eater. So it turns out that the quality of the stool matters. And you want to, I mean, again, if I ever need a stool transplant, I want to get some from the Hadza tribe in Tanzania who've been eating, in a very sort of indigenous way. So that matters. And that's something that really hadn't been considered in a lot of the FMT studies. The other thing that was done, it was a sort of one and done. So there've been several studies for autism where they've given 1 or 2 stool transplants and said, okay, well, this didn't really work. But there've been a few studies, one where they did 6 months of FMT and they were doing 2 a week and they changed the diet. And that one showed some pretty significant results. Many of those children became verbal, who are nonverbal, et cetera. So, if we think of FMT as a super probiotic, we start to see that it makes sense that the habitat that you put that stool into matters, right? We want to make sure that we have a habitat that those transplanted stool are going to thrive in. And when we've looked at our data at Georgetown for FMT for C. diff, we see that 2-3 months later, we're still seeing a microbial profile that's consistent with that transplanted stool. And so trying to figure out how to keep that going. And the best way to keep that going is to keep antibiotics and other medications that are disruptive to the microbiome at bay, and to keep feeding those microbes the high fiber foods. I think one of the things we're going to see in the future, the idea of, as scatological as I still am not super buzzed about the idea of eating someone's stool, even a close contact, even my husband or daughter. So I think where we're going to be heading in the future is looking at taking stool out of our gut, extracting the healthy microbes. Maybe we have smaller colonies of F. prosnitzii than we should, et cetera, and how we can amplify those healthy bacteria, our own healthy bacteria outside of the gut, and maybe then re-inoculate. I think we're going to be seeing more of these sort of microbe amplification techniques outside of the body, as opposed to somebody else's stool, because when you're introducing somebody else's microbes, you're also introducing the genetic material that comes with those microbes, and it's not always good, and we can't screen for all of it. So it is a little bit fraught, but certainly in the C. diff world, it has been tremendously successful. And in my world of inflammatory bowel disease with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, where many patients are doing FMT on their own with a family contact donor, which isn't something that is endorsed, but something that, if somebody does it, you can't prevent them from doing it. And so we have a lot of anecdotal data from those patients, and many of them doing very well. But again, they're typically doing the FMT twice a week, 2 to 3 times a week. I have a patient who was doing FMT with her daughter, and then her daughter got a little bit older into middle school and started demanding more time on the iPad and ice cream if she wanted to have her stool, and it got really tricky.
So Robin, we are getting a lot of questions. So I know you could probably fill up an hour on just one question, but
I'll make them fast.
I want to make sure we touch upon other people's. In fact, Steve Bumbaugh asked, I think this question is pretty straightforward. Early on, you talked about exposure to germs, and he wants to know if that's sort of akin to the same principle behind a vaccine.
Yeah, the principle behind a vaccine, it's a great question, Steve, and thanks for showing up and for being my friend. The principle behind a vaccine is that we have the innate immune system that we're born with, and it responds quickly, but in a non-specific way. And then we have the adaptive immune system that learns and remembers exposure to all these pathogens, so that when you're exposed to it again, you can create antibodies and mount a response. And so that's what a vaccine is. With the COVID vaccine, you get a little bit of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, a little bit of the spike protein, so that you make memory cells. And then when you're exposed to the actual virus, you can respond in a way to protect yourself. The way it works, the sort of early exposure to germs is similar, but not exactly the same thing. What it does is it trains the immune system, Steve. So it literally, those microbes on one side of the gut lining, immune cells on the other, the microbes are in the gut, which is where all this stuff is coming through, right? Remember, your gut is in contact with the environment. It's a hollow tube that runs from your mouth to your anus. So everything that you swallow, so let's say you're swallowing some rotavirus and it's in your gut. Those microbes send a message across the gut lining to the immune cells to say, hey, this is rotavirus. You need to release some interferons to interfere with viruses to start that immune cascade to protect, versus, oh yeah, this is just a harmless bacteria or virus. You don't need to do anything. So it's not really the same with the adaptive immunity, but what it is that exposure is essential for training, so that I almost, the analogy I like to use is, I have an only child, and I sometimes say she never had siblings like being mean to her. So maybe she's not as resilient because she didn't have to deal with, the sister being mean and the brother, I don't know, fighting when we were little. But it's that, maybe that's not the best analogy, but it is that exposure. If you haven't seen these things before, then the immune system doesn't know what to do. And in that case, it tends to overreact. So it is a sort of training of the immune system.
So you talked about the relationship of the gut and brain. Thomas Huggins has a question about how is the vagal nerve related to the gut and the microbiome?
The vagus nerve is a 10th cranial nerve, and it is the nerve that is responsible for the bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain. And when I say bidirectional, so in the gut, we talked about the enteric nervous system and all those nerve cells. And that's why you often get that sense in your gut. You have a gut feeling, butterflies, it's all very real. And we talked about neurotransmitters, serotonin and others being made in the gut. So the gut, what's going on in your gut can affect mood. It can affect cognition. We have a very important study from last spring from the Nurses' Health Study that showed that middle-aged women, which I'm happy they defined as mid-50s, middle-aged women who were exposed to 2 months or more of antibiotics over a period of about 7 years had a cognitive decline that was equivalent of aging the brain 3 to 4 years. So we know that antibiotics, because of their deleterious effect on the microbiome, can also not just affect your gut and potential for autoimmune disease, but also are affecting the brain. So a lot of that communication is through the vagus nerve, but the brain communicates and affects the gut through the vagus nerve. It affects gut motility, which is a contractility of the gut. It affects secretion of digestive enzymes and other aspects of gut function. So we see, for example, there's a well-known study where people injected in the lab mice with a heavy inoculum of Campylobacter jejuni, which is a typical foodborne bacterial illness. And they were able to induce anxiety in the mice as a result of the foodborne illness. Well, we see a version of that called post-infectious irritable bowel syndrome, where after an infectious episode, people will have changes in the gut, but they will often have mood disorders too. They'll describe being more anxious, more irritable, different changes. So we see that communication, and much of that communication is via the vagus nerve. And I just wanted to, I see Clara pointed out, it's not internal vaginal fluid that's important, but exposure to the fecal bacteria present on the mother's perineum, which is exactly right, that area between the vagina and the rectum. And Marty Blazer, who I mentioned, infectious disease doc at NYU, his wife, Gloria Domingo Velez, has done really important work looking at this method of vaginal seeding, where first C-section babies, they would take some gauze, swab it in that perineal area. So we're talking about the skin, and then swab down the baby's face and mouth. But I always admonish women, I said, make sure that your OBGYN knows this plan, because otherwise they're going to call security on you if you start taking a swab from between your legs and wiping your baby's face down, because of course in most hospitals are busy sterilizing the baby with some sort of antibacterial cleanser, which is probably not the right thing to be doing. But thank you for that, Clara.
There's been a bunch of questions relating to kind of food and if, certain foods are good or how do you counter things. And, Betty Ann asked about if rice is considered a plant-based food.
Yes, rice is.
I'm sure if we look at Gut Bliss, which is a great book, I recommend it, you could probably find all sorts of even dietary recommendations. And in fact, Robin has a website, robinchutkin.com, but there's one question in terms of, because we always, we're on the go, sort of the easy way to do it. What about all the sort of vegetable powders?
Yeah, I'm so glad somebody asked about athletic greens. Thank you, Diana, for that. Yeah, that's, as Michael Pollan in his wonderful book, In Defense of Food, wrote, eat food that your grandmother would have recognized as food. I think my grandmother would have gone, what is this? Because she had a farm. So yeah, those powders, really distinguishing between factory food. Athletic greens and those powders come from a factory in a canister. That is not a microbially rich food or even a nutrient-rich food. So there's so much marketing around this. And I was commenting to a patient today in my office. I said, why are people so averse to eating vegetables? It's just, people will go to great lengths to avoid eating vegetables. So I don't think there's really benefit to things like athletic greens. I mean, if you're on a desert island with no access to vegetables, but I think eating an actual vegetable grown in soil in a relatively fresh state is always going to be vastly superior.
With all of these, for some people, some of the food recommendations you'd make, maybe that it's what they're already doing. And for some people, it's maybe more of a stretch. Is it all or nothing?
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. And in fact, one of the other really beautiful studies was a study that was published in the journal Nature in 2014. And this was a study that was done in Massachusetts. It's a Harvard study where they took 9 volunteers and they put them first on an Atkins type diet. So high animal protein, animal fat, low carbohydrate, pork rinds and prosciutto, literally. And they looked at the microbiome, and I'm getting heartburn thinking about it, but they looked at the microbiome before, during, and after, and then they rested those same 9 volunteers, and they put them on a plant-based diet, nothing extraordinary, jasmine rice, lentils, mango for snack instead of pork rinds. And what they found was that within about 30 hours of food hitting the gut, things started to change dramatically, not just the microbes. So one of the big microbial changes was that the bibliophilia, the bile-loving bacteria that are essential for breaking down animal protein, those dropped dramatically. And so bibliophilia are also involved in diarrheal illness and inflammation. So they saw a drop in that. They saw an increase in the healthy F prosnitzi, but even more spectacularly, they saw different genes being turned on and off quickly within 30 hours of that dietary change. And so, I remind people that the microbiome you go to bed with Thursday night could be very different from the one you wake up with on Saturday morning. And every little plant that you eat, every bit matters. I tell my patients, I talk about the 1, 2, 3 rule: 1 vegetable in the morning, 2 at lunch, 3 at dinner. So even if you're eating a big omelet, eat a carrot, throw some spinach in there. Really think about the amount of plants. And I focus on the vegetables because most people are pretty good with the grains and the fruit and so on, but the vegetables, people have a hard time with. So if you just think about that 1, 2, 3 rule, I'm going to have 1 vegetable in the morning, I'm going to have 2 at lunch, and I'm going to have 3 at dinner. It could be a salad at dinner with lettuce and tomato, but then you also do some green beans. It could be a soup, etc. And every little bit of that counts. And I'll tell you, in my practice, we're very focused on treating patients with chronic autoimmune disease, specifically Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, with a food as medicine approach. I still certainly prescribe, but I do a lot of unprescribing, and we see really dramatic results with small shifts in the diet, with things like, getting people to get off soda, getting people to eat less processed refined carbohydrates, getting people to eat more of these fermentable fibers. And it really does make a difference. I don't know if anybody else listens to the Rich Roll podcast, but and if you do, check out my episode, but a few episodes before me was this just incredible gentleman named Mike Fremont. Mike Fremont is 101 years old. He was diagnosed with metastatic colon cancer at 69, became a plant-based eater at 69. He runs 3 days a week. He kayaks or canoes, paddles 3 other days a week. I think he takes a day of rest. He has a group of elderly paddlers, a think tank. I mean, he's just a wonder. He's a tremendous person. And, really showing the power of changing the diet, exercise, all of these things, community.
So, in fact, to follow on that, Thomas also had a follow-up question. If in fact, people are eating animal protein, meat, is it better in terms of issues of microbiome that if you're eating organic, grass-fed animals?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
The better quality meat is a good idea. And maybe even just eating a little less of it. Think about the animal protein as palm-sized and really crowd the plate with as many other things as you can, with salad, vegetables, lentils, brown rice, quinoa, all these other things. But I do, I spend a lot of time in vegan company with people like Caldwell Esselstyn, who's also a Yale, and the author of some great books, and Rich Roll and Scott Urick and all these wonderful plant-based folks, Neil Barnard, who runs the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. But I will tell you, as a gastroenterologist who spends a lot of time inside people's GI tracts, there are other reasons to be completely plant-based, from the planet and ethical reasons, etc. But if we look at this strictly from a health point of view and from a disease point of view, I do believe that you can get to a very healthy place, still making some room for animal protein if that is your choice. So it's less about never eating meat, and it's more about making sure you increase access to those microbiota accessible carbohydrates. That's the really important piece, is what we're missing on our plates.
Intermittent fasting. Fasting and intermittent fasting right now is
a thing.
Is a thing.
Yeah, so I'll tell you that our GI tracts, and there's so many of these fascinating things that I think I never learned about this in gastroenterology, but these are actual facts. Our gastrointestinal tract is tied, the contractility is tied to the light-dark cycle, their circadian rhythm, which means in the morning when the sun rises, our GI tracts are quite active. And as the sun sets and it gets darker, our GI tracts are much less active. And unfortunately, that's when so many of us are sitting down for our largest meal of the day, after dark. So particularly if you're somebody who struggles with bloating or reflux, calorie shifting, breakfast like a king or queen, lunch like a prince or princess, and dinner like a pauper is sort of the old saying, but eating a larger breakfast and lunch and a lighter dinner will help, because our GI tracts just can't handle a big onslaught of food once sun has set. And so giving your GI tract some time. Now, people do intermittent fasting on different schedules that work for them. For several years, I did a Monday-Thursday fast because those were my busiest days at work. And I would eat Sunday night and I wouldn't eat again till Monday night. And I would eat Wednesday night and I wouldn't eat again until Thursday night. So I had a 24-hour fast those days and I really enjoyed it. I felt very energized and very hungry by the time dinner came, and very grateful for the food. But I think whatever schedule you're thinking of doing intermittent fasting, the thing I want you to think about is stopping eating right around when the sun sets. It doesn't matter so much when you start. And Walter Longo, who's done a lot of work on fasting, has some interesting thoughts on this in his book. So I think when you eat in the morning is less important. I generally eat when I'm hungry, which is usually not till about 10 a.m., but it's not on a strict schedule. But I do try to stop eating right around that sunset. And that's going to change as the seasons change. So in the summer, that could be 8 o'clock, but in the winter, it could be 5 o'clock. So paying attention to the circadian rhythm and your gastric contractility and intestinal contractility is important. And particularly, again, if you suffer from reflux, bloating, any of those things.
So we're a minute away from the top of the hour. So I'm going to let people know Chelsea's given us the thumbs up that we can spill over a little bit. So I'm going to hit you. with a few more questions. And Jeff, I see your hand up. I will get to you, sure. Lactose intolerance will making your gut biome better help you with lactose intolerance?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Diana. I'll tell you, the enzyme that breaks down lactose, which is called lactase, is located in the small intestine on the brush border, those little villi. And most of us will lose it as we get older, because as human adults, we're not really designed to be suckling a postpartum cow. And that's really what that is, right? I mean, it sounds sort of crass, but dairy is really designed for baby cows. And so most of us will lose our ability to tolerate dairy. And in different ethnic groups, we see much higher rates of lactose intolerance. And that's mostly as a result of evolutionarily where you grew up. Did you grow up in, your ancestors grew up in sub-Saharan Africa versus Western Europe, where dairy was being consumed. So we see those ethnic differences. But about 70% of the world's population, adult population, has some degree of lactose intolerance, again, because we're not really designed to be having dairy. So I recommend thinking about dairy as a treat. Ice cream, not a health food. The dairy that we eat is pasteurized, which means it's heated to very high temperatures to kill any bacteria, and then it's cooled quickly. And then what they do for marketing purposes with yogurt and things like that is they add in 1 or 2 strains of bacteria in low amounts. But it's not the raw dairy that Mechnikov looked at when he did his studies in the early 1900s, looking at Romanians and other Eastern Europeans who were living long lives. They were drinking raw dairy from cows that they were raising that had never seen an antibiotic, because this was, of course, before penicillin. We can't equate that with the dairy that we're getting in the stores now, where so much of those cows are exposed to antibiotics. We know from a New York Times expose that well over a decade ago, that the dairy industry, they're supposed to pull the cows out of the line when they're on antibiotics. But they're on antibiotics continually because they're in these machines, these milking machines, and their udders get pussy and raw from, constantly being milked. And they're being given hormones to increase the milk production. And because they are hormones that occur in nature, they can get those hormones and still call the milk organic. So we know that even the organic milk, that there's hormones in it, there are antibiotics that the animals are exposed to. And so to call that product a health product is a little bit of a stretch. So, enjoy a little bit of dairy as a treat, as ice cream, if you like it. But I think equating that with a health food is, sauerkraut is a health food. That's a fermented health food, but wine and cheese, not so much, although my French friends might beg to differ.
Doreen asks a very simple question, cooked versus raw.
Both. However you can get them down. Obviously, there are clear advantages to raw vegetables for sure, because when you think about some of the enzymes, like in fruit, for example, pineapple has an enzyme called bromelain in it, and papaya has papain, which helps break down animal protein. And we know that raw versions of these fruits and vegetables, a lot of these enzymes in them are more active. But cooked vegetables are also wonderful too. And for many of us, we can tolerate more cooked vegetables, sauteed, steamed, boiled. I'm a big fan of the green smoothie and blending. So just don't cook them to death. You don't want to really overcook, but if you like them cooked, that's absolutely fine.
And what about, Jackson asks a question about these products that we use, to clean our hair. Is it better? Do they interact with the gut? And should we be thinking about more natural cosmetic products in relation to the microbiome?
Absolutely. In the second book, The Microbiome Solution, I talk a lot about, there's a whole recipe section in there, and also in Gut Bliss for natural products, because the sodium lauryl sulfates and these different lathering, sudsing things can damage our skin. They make our skin more permeable. They increase the permeability of the skin. And just as with the gut, The gut lining is there to protect us. Again, it's that one cell thick barrier that is protecting us from the external environment that we're swallowing and protecting our insides. Well, the skin, the same thing. The skin is an important barrier to protect us from the external environment. And many of the chemicals in these shampoos, conditioners, lotions, makeup, etc., increase the skin permeability. And so we are absorbing these chemicals. I mean, if you've had the experience ever of putting on makeup, and I realize that may not necessarily apply to everyone on the call, but if you put makeup on in the morning and then you notice by evening or nighttime, the makeup's kind of gone. Like, where did it go? Or even if you put lotion on and it's very sort of oily, and then the lotion gets absorbed through the skin. So after our digestive tract, our skin is our second largest digestive organ. We are absorbing all of those things. It absorbs things, it excretes things. And so we do have to be careful about those substances. So using more natural products, coconut oil, manuka honey, different things like that, apple cider vinegar that we can use to rinse hair. I have lots of fun recipes. Those things are fun to play around with. And I do think in the beauty industry, we've definitely seen a trend towards more natural products, better quality. You look at things like Tata Harper. All her botanical products are grown on her farm in Maine, I believe. So more products, more botanical products, and less chemicals in a lot of these products.
Jeff, do you want to ask your question?
I do, and thank you for asking. I like live questions. It kind of breaks things up a little bit, so I'm not a chatter. I like to do live. Great show. I mean, this is just hitting so many important points. I wanted to just ask quickly the relationship, in your view, a couple of comments on sleep and the microbiome. You know, older male guy up 2-3 times a night, try to go back to sleep. I can just feel my gut rolling around. Just any thoughts, comments there?
I am so glad you asked that, Jeff. I will tell you, with this latest book, The Antiviral Gut, that shameless plug for the books that came out in November, when I turned the manuscript into my team at Avery at Penguin Random House, the sleep chapter was 62 pages. And my editor said to me, Matt Walker wrote that book already. It's called Why We Sleep. Like, you got to trim this chapter down. Because, Jeff, there was so much data about sleep and the immune system and sleep and the gut. And one of the things he talked about is this huge worldwide experiment we do called daylight saving time. And how when we lose an hour, there is a 22% increase in cardiac events in emergency rooms around the country the next day. And conversely, when we gain the hour, there's a significant drop. I mean, it's crazy. So sleep, it turns out, is really critical for sort of rebooting our immune computer. And there's a study from the British Medical Journal in 2021 that showed an 88% increase in likelihood of getting COVID if you're chronically sleep deprived. We know that vaccine efficacy drops dramatically. Influenza, hepatitis, and COVID vaccines, 50% less efficacious if you are sleep deprived in the 2 days before you receive the vaccine. Like, really startling data. So sleep is essential. I mean, we look at the sleep dementia risk now, you know, as a risk factor, heart disease, and there's also a very strong correlation with the gut. So there's a whole section on sleep in this book. As I said, I had to cut it from 61 pages down to about 17, but it is makes a tremendous difference.
We will talk more. Thank you.
But read Matt Walker's book, Why We Sleep. He has a master class, and
I've read that. Yeah.
You've read it, yeah, great book.
This is going to have to be just a little teaser sampling of the wealth of information, and you know, I mean, I was going to say at the outset, it's very clear, you know, how Robin became a media expert. I mean,
in her own mind.
I mean, she is so engaging and so enthusiastic. I mean, somebody that can make the intestinal tract, you know, sexy is. I mean, and if anybody is a sell for what attending to your microbiome could do in terms of clarity of thought and general well-being, I mean, Robin could be the poster child. So
Very kind, Steph.
Manuel has put in the chat Robin's website, which may be the source for answering a lot of the questions we didn't get to, but it's, you know, pretty simple. I mean, you just Google Robin Chutkin and you'll find her website, along with multiple other ideas and contributions that she's made. But I wanted to give her an opportunity. I mean, you've been fielding these questions like, you know, this is batting practice and it's the batting machine. In the time, you know, that I want to give you an opportunity to address anything that you think we haven't talked about this.
Yeah,
night.
I'd like to really end with just a quick paragraph reading that I think sums up where we are so well. So on January 20th, 2020, the British registered Diamond Princess departed Yokohama, Japan. 5 days after leaving port, an 80-year-old man on board disembarked to seek medical attention for a fever and cough. 1 week later, Hong Kong officials announced that the passenger, Mr. A, had pneumonia as a result of infection with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID. The Diamond Princess outbreak represents the kind of experiment we can't do in real life. Put a variety of people together in close quarters, expose them to a novel and highly contagious virus, and see what happens next. Ultimately, 1 in 5 people on board would become infected with a fatality rate of about 2%. Those numbers, particularly the small but significant percentage who died and the larger unknown number who survived but continue to have symptoms, lead us to one of the most important questions of this and future pandemics: why them? Why do some people suffer from severe and even fatal forms of viral illnesses like COVID, while others experience only mild symptoms or none at all? Why, despite repeated exposure, do some people never get infected? What determines who makes a complete recovery and who ends up leaving a ship horizontally? So if I could sum it all up in one sentence, I would leave you with: host health matters. We, the host, our health matters. It is the most important determinant of how we're going to do, not just for viral illnesses like COVID, but for heart disease and cancer and stroke and diabetes and everything else. And to be clear, there are times when things fall out of the sky and flatten perfectly healthy people, and nobody deserves to have a bad outcome. And that is certainly true, that sometimes perfectly healthy people drop dead of things and we just can't explain it. But so often we can follow those breadcrumbs backward and think, was it the acid blocker they were taking that blocked all the stomach acid, and so you didn't have stomach acid to unravel viral protein? Was it the antibiotics they'd been taking? Was it the biologics they're on, the steroids, the immunosuppressive drugs, etc.? Was it the diet they'd been eating? So all of us can be healthier hosts. Even if we're elderly or sickly or have chronic diseases, we can be healthier hosts, and we can be healthier hosts by getting outside and getting exposed to soil microbes. Even better, maybe growing a little food outside, like my friend Steve Bumbaugh does in his yard. So get exposed to soil microbes, eat more plants, get some sleep, and judicious use of medications. And that's my best advice.
Excellent. I'm sure, you know, the thank yous have been coming into the chat. And so I just, you know, want to personally thank you for participating. Our attendance tonight was through the roof, and you certainly have inspired everybody out to go and steam a vegetable.
And don't worry about the showering. It's fine.
Get
a little dirty.
Thank you. And
thank you so
everybody.
much, everyone. Thank you, Steph and Steve and everyone. And such a pleasure to be in such great company tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.